Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into Tudor England, a world of muddy streets, questionable hygiene, and enough social climbing to make a modern corporate office look relaxed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you were fortunate enough to become a royal falconer in Tudor England, you had discovered one of the closest things the 16th century offered to a dream job. While most of the population spent their days ploughing fields, carrying heavy objects from one location to another, and then carrying them back again for reasons that no longer seem entirely clear, you were employed to look after some very expensive birds. And not just any birds. These were falcons. In Tudor society, falcons were status symbols with feathers. Owning a magnificent hunting bird told everyone that you were wealthy, important, and had enough free time to spend entire afternoons watching wildlife get chased through the countryside. Naturally, the richer the owner, the more impressive the falcon. Kings and great nobles imported rare birds from distant lands. Some came from Iceland, others from Scandinavia, and many cost sums that would have allowed an ordinary peasant family to eat comfortably for years. Imagine explaining to a farmer that a single bird was worth more than his house. Actually, don't imagine it. The farmer already knew. He was probably paying taxes to support the bird. As royal falconer, your responsibility was to keep these feathered aristocrats healthy and ready for hunting. You inspected their wings, monitored their diet, maintained their equipment, and trained them to obey commands, or at least attempted to. Falcons, unfortunately, had not read the employment contract. Unlike horses or dogs, they possessed a remarkable confidence that they could survive perfectly well without human assistance. Every day involved convincing an apex predator that cooperation was somehow in its best interest. Sometimes the bird agreed. Sometimes the bird disappeared into the horizon and left you explaining the situation to a nobleman who had just spent a fortune importing it. That conversation was rarely enjoyable. Still, compared to most Tudor occupations, the advantages were extraordinary. You worked outdoors rather than inside a smoky workshop. You spent your days in royal forests instead of muddy fields. You enjoyed respectable wages. And perhaps most importantly, your work brought you into direct contact with the highest levels of society. During royal hunts, kings, queens, ambassadors, noblemen and courtiers gathered together. While most Englishmen would never come within shouting distance of the monarch, you might spend hours beside him discussing the condition of a bird. This may sound absurd. That's because it was. Entire political careers rose and fell around access to the king, while you could gain that access simply because a falcon needed feeding. The position also carried prestige. Falconry was considered an elite art requiring patience, expertise, and years of experience. A skilled falconer was respected throughout noble society. Of course, there were occasional drawbacks. The weather was often miserable, the birds had sharp talons, and if a valuable falcon escaped, you suddenly became the most unpopular person within several counties. Yet when compared to the average Tudor worker, your life looked remarkably comfortable. The average labourer spent 12 hours breaking his back to earn enough money for bread. You spent the day walking through royal hunting grounds with magnificent birds perched on your arm, while noblemen praised your expertise. In a century filled with plague, poverty, religious turmoil, and alarming rates of accidental death, being a royal falconer was one of the few careers where your biggest workplace problem might be a bird deciding it had better places to be. Frankly, many modern jobs sound less appealing. While the royal falconer spent his days managing birds that occasionally ignored instructions, the king's jester spent his days doing something even more dangerous, telling jokes to people who could have him executed. At first glance, becoming a jester might sound ridiculous. After all, who dreams of growing up to wear colourful clothing and entertain adults for a living? Yet in Tudor England, a successful court jester occupied a surprisingly privileged position. Most people at court had to measure every word carefully. A careless comment could ruin a reputation, destroy a career, or in extreme cases, create an unexpected appointment with the executioner. The jester, however, operated under different rules. His job was to speak the truth through humour. If a nobleman was behaving foolishly, the jester could mock him. If court politics became absurd, the jester could point it out. If the king made a questionable decision, the jester might even joke about it. Of course, there were limits. This was still Tudor England, not a modern comedy club. You could mock powerful people, but you needed excellent instincts for knowing exactly how far to push a joke before it transformed from entertainment into treason. Think of it as walking a tightrope above a pit full of lawyers, except the lawyers occasionally carried axes. A talented jester could become remarkably influential. Kings often valued their company because jesters provided something rare: honesty. Courtiers constantly flattered the monarch. Advisors carefully chose their words. Ambassadors spoke in diplomatic riddles. Meanwhile, the jester could simply say, "That seems like a terrible idea," and somehow get away with it if he wrapped it in enough humour. Some jesters became trusted companions to rulers. They attended banquets, hunts, celebrations, and private gatherings. They heard conversations that ordinary people would never hear and witnessed political dramas from the front row. The position also came with practical advantages. You lived comfortably. You ate well. You enjoyed royal protection. And unlike most workers, your success depended on wit rather than physical strength. That was a major advantage in a society where many careers involved lifting increasingly heavy objects until your joints permanently filed for retirement. Naturally, the profession was not entirely stress-free. One bad joke could end a career. A poorly timed insult could offend the wrong person. And every audience included some powerful noble who believed he was much smarter than he actually was. Still, compared to spending your life harvesting turnips in the rain, being paid to make the king laugh was a surprisingly attractive career. Provided, of course, that the king actually laughed. That detail mattered considerably. If becoming a jester required courage and becoming a falconer required patience, becoming a royal barber surgeon required something even more impressive: confidence. An extraordinary amount of confidence. The barber surgeon occupied one of the strangest professions in Tudor England, because he combined two jobs that modern society wisely decided should be kept very far apart. One moment he might be trimming a nobleman's beard. The next moment he might be removing a tooth. A few minutes later he could be amputating a limb. Then, after washing his hands to the exact standards of Tudor medicine, which is to say, perhaps not at all, he might return to cutting someone's hair. It was an efficient system. Terrifying but efficient. In Tudor England, physicians studied at universities and spent their time discussing ancient medical theories. Barber surgeons handled the practical work. They pulled teeth, treated wounds, set broken bones, drained infections, and performed minor surgeries. When soldiers returned from battle with injuries, barber surgeons often dealt with the consequences. When someone developed a painful abscess, the barber surgeon was summoned. When a nobleman looked in the mirror and decided his beard needed attention, the barber surgeon was once again called into action. Few careers offered such variety. Very few people could honestly say they had spent the morning discussing hairstyles and the afternoon sawing through a leg. The profession became even more important at court. Kings and nobles constantly required grooming. Fashion mattered enormously among the Tudor elite, and appearance could influence status and reputation. A royal barber therefore gained regular access to powerful people, and access to power was one of the most valuable currencies in England. The king might trust his advisors, but he usually saw his barber more often. Of course, there were significant challenges. Medical knowledge remained painfully limited. Many treatments were based on ancient ideas that were often incorrect. Bloodletting remained popular despite its remarkable inability to solve most problems. If a patient survived, your reputation improved. If a patient died, people sometimes blamed the illness. This was one of the few professions where success often depended on convincing everyone that the disease was more incompetent than you were. Yet despite these difficulties, skilled barber surgeons earned respectable incomes and enjoyed considerable social standing. Their services were always needed. Their skills were difficult to replace, and unlike the average labourer, they worked with specialised knowledge rather than raw muscle. In many ways, the barber surgeon represented one of Tudor England's best career opportunities. After all, most workers merely suffered workplace injuries. The barber surgeon got paid to look at them. Admittedly, he occasionally caused a few as well, but that was considered a separate matter entirely. If you wanted one of the most exciting jobs in Tudor England, without risking being eaten by a lion, kicked by a horse, or accidentally amputated by a barber surgeon, becoming a master printer was an excellent choice. You were essentially working at the centre of England's information revolution. Of course, nobody called it an information revolution. Most people were too busy trying to survive the winter. But it was happening nonetheless. For centuries, books had been copied by hand. Producing a single manuscript required enormous amounts of time, skill, and patience. Monks spent countless hours hunched over desks, carefully copying texts one page at a time. Then printing arrived and ruined that business model forever. Suddenly, books, pamphlets, religious texts, official proclamations, and political arguments could be reproduced far more quickly than ever before. And if there was one thing Tudor England never lacked, it was people arguing about religion. The timing could not have been better. The reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I brought enormous religious and political changes. Every new policy required announcements. Every faction wanted its ideas distributed. Every government wanted its version of events printed and circulated. Printers found themselves at the centre of it all. A successful master printer owned expensive equipment, employed skilled workers, and managed a growing business. Unlike a peasant, whose financial future depended largely on the weather, a printer's prosperity depended on literacy, demand, and political developments. And Tudor politics generated enough material to keep presses busy for years. The profession also carried prestige. Printers worked with scholars, merchants, church officials, lawyers, and government administrators. They interacted with some of the most educated people in the kingdom. This alone made them unusual. In a society where many people could not read, printers were helping shape what others read. That gave them influence. It also occasionally gave them headaches, because printing the wrong thing could be dangerous. Very dangerous. A religious book approved under one monarch might become illegal under the next. A pamphlet praised one year might get you arrested the following year. The presses themselves remained the same. Only the list of forbidden opinions changed. And in Tudor England, that list had a tendency to change with alarming frequency. Still, compared to most occupations, the rewards were remarkable. You worked indoors. You managed a respected business. You participated in the spread of knowledge, and you avoided spending your days chasing livestock through muddy fields. In an age when information was becoming one of the kingdom's most valuable resources, the master printer was perfectly positioned. As long as he remembered one important rule, always make sure the king agrees with what you're printing, or at least make sure it's the current king. Most people in Tudor England would go their entire lives without seeing anything more exotic than a deer, a fox, or an unusually aggressive goose. The keeper of the royal menagerie, however, might start his morning feeding a lion, which immediately made his job more interesting than most. For centuries, English monarchs collected exotic animals as symbols of power and prestige. These creatures were housed in royal menageries, the most famous being located at the Tower of London. Kings received unusual animals as diplomatic gifts from foreign rulers eager to impress the English crown. A king could receive gold, jewels, or fine fabrics, but nothing demonstrated international friendship quite like sending someone a large carnivore. As a result, the royal collection eventually included lions, leopards, monkeys, eagles, bears, and various other creatures that had absolutely no business being in England's climate. Someone needed to care for them. That someone was the keeper of the menagerie. The position was far more complicated than simply throwing food into cages. Exotic animals required specialized care, secure enclosures, and constant supervision. Many of these creatures came from regions thousands of miles away. Nobody possessed detailed manuals explaining how to care for them. The keeper often learned through experience. Sometimes successful experience, sometimes less successful experience. The lion was particularly important. Lions symbolized royal authority and appeared on England's coat of arms. Visitors expected to see impressive beasts when they visited royal collections. This created pressure. A lion that appeared majestic enhanced the king's reputation. A lion that appeared miserable reflected poorly on everyone involved. No one wanted to explain to the monarch why his symbol of royal power looked disappointed. The job also carried significant prestige. Foreign ambassadors, noble visitors, and important guests frequently toured the royal menagerie. The keeper acted as both caretaker and guide, explaining the animals and demonstrating his expertise. Unlike ordinary workers, he spent his days dealing with creatures that most people only heard about in stories. Of course, there were risks. A farmer might get kicked by a cow. A menagerie keeper might get mauled by a leopard. The potential consequences were somewhat different. Yet compared to the average Tudor occupation, the position remained remarkably attractive. It offered stable employment, royal patronage, unusual responsibilities, and endless stories. After all, very few people could sit in a tavern at the end of the day and casually mention that they had spent the morning arguing with a monkey and the afternoon feeding a lion. In Tudor England, that was considered a productive day at work. And honestly, it sounds far more entertaining than harvesting turnips. The title alone sounds impressive. Merchant adventurer. It sounds less like a profession and more like someone who accidentally wandered into a fantasy novel. You might imagine sword fights, hidden treasure, and daring escapes from pirates. The reality was slightly less glamorous. Most of the time, a merchant adventurer was a businessman. A very wealthy businessman, and in Tudor England, that could be far more rewarding than being a knight. Merchant adventurers formed one of England's most powerful trading organisations. Their members exported English cloth across Europe and returned with profits large enough to make noble families nervous. While peasants worried about whether the harvest would survive the season, successful merchants worried about things like exchange rates, shipping schedules, and which city would generate the highest profits. One of these problems was considerably more pleasant than the others. The career offered opportunities that were almost impossible to find elsewhere. Travel, wealth, influence, and perhaps most importantly, a realistic chance of improving your social status. In Tudor society, most people remained in the class they were born into. A farmer's son usually became a farmer. A blacksmith's son usually became a blacksmith. A successful merchant, however, could become something entirely different. Many wealthy trading families eventually purchased estates, gained influence, and mingled with the gentry. Money opened doors, and merchant adventurers earned plenty of it. Of course, there were dangers. Travelling across Europe was not exactly a relaxing holiday. Roads were poor. Bandits existed. Ships could sink. Wars could suddenly interrupt trade routes. And there was always the possibility that months of expensive cargo would disappear beneath the sea because a storm decided it had other plans. Insurance was still developing. Prayer remained a popular backup strategy. Yet despite these risks, the rewards were extraordinary. Successful merchants lived in large homes, wore expensive clothing, employed servants, and enjoyed diets that looked dramatically different from those of ordinary workers. While a labourer might celebrate receiving an extra piece of bread, a prosperous merchant could be negotiating international contracts over a lavish dinner. The profession also offered something unusual for Tudor England: excitement. Many people spent their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Merchant adventurers visited foreign ports, met people from different cultures, and saw parts of Europe that most Englishmen could scarcely imagine. Not every voyage produced riches, not every investment succeeded, but for ambitious individuals willing to accept risk, few careers offered greater rewards. In a kingdom filled with hard labour and limited opportunities, merchant adventurers discovered an astonishing secret. Sometimes the best way to get rich was simply to sell cloth to people who lived somewhere else. History can be surprisingly complicated. Sometimes it can also be surprisingly simple. If you asked a Tudor peasant to describe the ideal career, professional musician probably would not have been the first answer, mostly because the peasant was busy trying to survive. But for talented performers, becoming a court musician was one of the most comfortable and prestigious jobs in England. Unlike farmers, they did not spend their days battling weather. Unlike soldiers, they were rarely stabbed. Unlike sailors, they generally remained on land, which immediately improved their odds of survival. Their job was simple: play music, play it well, and most importantly, play it when important people wanted to hear it. The Tudor court loved music. Henry VIII was particularly enthusiastic. He played several instruments, composed music, and spent lavishly on entertainment. If there was a banquet, a celebration, a wedding, a diplomatic visit, or simply an evening where nobody was being accused of treason, music was expected. Lots of music. Court musicians performed on lutes, viols, recorders, shawms, organs, trumpets, and dozens of other instruments that sound either elegant or vaguely dangerous. A talented musician could quickly become valuable, very valuable. While thousands of labourers could dig a ditch, far fewer people could perform complex compositions before kings and ambassadors without embarrassing themselves. Skill created opportunity, and opportunity created comfort. Court musicians often received regular wages, fine clothing, lodging, and access to elite society. They ate better than most people, lived better than most people, and worked in considerably cleaner environments than most people. The competition, however, was fierce. The Tudor court attracted talented performers from across Europe. Musicians constantly had to improve their abilities because there was always someone younger, faster, and capable of playing an absurd number of notes in a very short amount of time. Still, the profession had advantages that were difficult to ignore. Imagine attending royal banquets, witnessing historic events, travelling with noble households, meeting ambassadors from foreign kingdoms, all because you happened to be exceptionally good at making pleasant sounds. Of course, there were occasional problems. If a performance went badly, everyone noticed. If an important guest disliked the music, everyone noticed. If you accidentally played the wrong piece during a formal ceremony, everyone definitely noticed. Court audiences could be surprisingly demanding, especially when the audience included a monarch who could spend more money on a single feast than an entire village earned in years. Yet compared to the average Tudor worker, life as a court musician was remarkably appealing. While most Englishmen spent their days struggling to earn a living, you spent yours entertaining royalty. Not a bad arrangement, particularly in a century where many careers involved significantly more plague and significantly less applause. If the royal falconer was responsible for the birds, the royal huntsman was responsible for nearly everything else that moved through the forests. And in Tudor England, hunting was serious business. Very serious business. Modern people often think of hunting as a hobby. For Tudor nobles, it was part sport, part social event, part political networking opportunity, and part excuse to wear expensive clothing while riding through the countryside. The king hunted, the queen hunted, the nobility hunted, foreign ambassadors hunted. If someone possessed status, there was a good chance they were spending at least part of the year chasing animals through royal forests. Naturally, none of this happened by itself. That was where the huntsman came in. A royal huntsman managed every aspect of the hunt. He tracked game, maintained hunting grounds, organised hunting parties, supervised hunting dogs, and ensured everything ran smoothly when important guests arrived. The dogs alone were practically a full-time responsibility. Large packs of hounds required feeding, training, housing, and constant attention. Some huntsmen spent years developing bloodlines of hunting dogs that were prized throughout England. In many ways, they were running one of the kingdom's most specialised animal operations. Except their employees barked. The position carried considerable prestige. Unlike ordinary workers who rarely saw a nobleman, the royal huntsman spent much of his time around the highest-ranking individuals in the kingdom. When Henry VIII rode into the forest for a hunt, the huntsman was there. When foreign dignitaries visited and participated in hunting parties, the huntsman was there. When important conversations took place between powerful people during long rides through the countryside, the huntsman was often nearby. This meant access, and in Tudor England, access was often worth more than money. Of course, the work was not entirely glamorous. The weather frequently refused to cooperate. Animals occasionally refused to cooperate, and noblemen sometimes refused to cooperate. In fact, a surprising amount of the profession involved persuading living creatures to behave sensibly, including the humans. Still, compared to most Tudor careers, the advantages were remarkable. You worked outdoors in beautiful forests rather than filthy city streets. You enjoyed stable employment. You handled valuable animals. You interacted with royalty. And you avoided the endless physical labour that dominated the lives of ordinary people. While a farmer spent his day worrying about whether rain would ruin his crops, the royal huntsman spent his day organising a hunt for kings and nobles. Admittedly, he was still worrying about the weather, but at least he was doing it on horseback, surrounded by trained hounds, and getting paid considerably better for the privilege. For most people in Tudor England, dinner was not a particularly exciting event. Bread, porridge, maybe some vegetables. If things were going exceptionally well, perhaps a little meat. Then you repeated the process tomorrow, and the next day, and probably the day after that. The master cook, however, lived in an entirely different world. He worked at the heart of the great noble households where feasts could involve dozens of servants, hundreds of guests, and enough food to make a modern buffet manager nervous. A successful master cook was not simply someone who knew how to prepare meals. He was part artist, part manager, part accountant, and part military commander. Large kitchens operated like small armies. Servants prepared ingredients. Bakers produced bread. Butchers processed meat. Scullions cleaned equipment. Messengers rushed between storage rooms and kitchens carrying instructions. The master cook directed all of it. One mistake could create chaos. Imagine preparing a banquet for 200 guests without electricity, refrigeration, running water, or modern ovens. Now imagine the host is one of the most powerful nobles in England. Suddenly the pressure becomes easier to understand. Yet the rewards were enormous. Great households competed fiercely through hospitality. A magnificent feast demonstrated wealth and prestige. Visitors judged noble families by the quality of their tables. If guests left impressed, the cook received praise. If guests left hungry, the cook received something considerably less pleasant. A talented cook therefore became extremely valuable. Some earned excellent wages, others enjoyed private accommodations, respected status, and access to foods that ordinary people could barely imagine. While peasants might spend months without tasting fresh meat, the master cook handled venison, swan, pheasant, beef, lamb, imported spices, fine wines, and exotic ingredients from across Europe. The kitchen was one of the few places in Tudor England where someone could accidentally eat better than a knight. The profession also offered remarkable job security. No matter how unstable politics became, people continued eating. Kings argued, Parliament argued, religious leaders argued. Everyone still wanted dinner. Of course, the work itself was exhausting. Banquets could require days of preparation. Feast days created enormous pressure, and noble guests possessed a unique talent for arriving hungry. Still, compared with most Tudor occupations, being a master cook was a surprisingly attractive career. You worked indoors. You earned respect. You enjoyed access to the finest foods in the kingdom. And unlike the average labourer, your greatest workplace danger was not starvation. It was resisting the temptation to sample the king's dessert before it reached the table. If you wanted one of the most unusual careers in Tudor England, becoming a court painter was a remarkably good choice. After all, most people spent their lives trying not to be noticed. A court painter spent his life making sure everyone would be remembered, or at least remembered in a much more flattering way than reality deserved. Because long before photography existed, portraits served an important purpose. They showed power, they displayed wealth, they shaped reputations, and occasionally they concealed an alarming amount of truth. When a nobleman commissioned a portrait, he was not usually asking for complete honesty. He wanted to look powerful, confident, distinguished, preferably younger, if possible much younger. The court painter's job was to make all of this happen without technically lying, a difficult balancing act, particularly when the subject resembled an exhausted potato wearing expensive clothing. The Tudors took portraits very seriously. Kings and queens used them as political tools. Potential marriage alliances often depended on portraits. Foreign rulers judged one another through painted images long before they met in person. This gave painters enormous influence. A skilled artist could help shape how an entire kingdom viewed a ruler. A poor artist could accidentally create a diplomatic incident. Imagine painting a future queen in a way that made her appear 20 years older. The consequences would be memorable, and probably not in a good way. The most successful painters enjoyed lives that many people envied. They received royal patronage. They worked indoors. They interacted with nobles, ambassadors, and members of the royal family. And unlike most Tudor workers, they spent their days holding brushes rather than lifting sacks of grain. Their workshops became gathering places for wealthy clients, seeking portraits of themselves, their spouses, their children, and occasionally their favourite possessions. Some nobles seemed almost as proud of their jewellery as their families. The profession also offered something rare: creative freedom. Not complete freedom, of course. If Henry VIII wanted to appear powerful, you painted power. If a noble woman wanted to appear elegant, you painted elegance. Nobody ever paid for a portrait that accurately captured their worst qualities. That market remained surprisingly underdeveloped. Still, compared to many Tudor careers, court painting offered an excellent combination of comfort, prestige, and financial reward. You avoided the mud. You avoided the plague-ridden streets whenever possible. You avoided chasing livestock across fields, and instead spent your days creating images that might survive for centuries. Not bad for a job that essentially involved convincing wealthy people they looked better than they actually did. To be fair, some of them desperately needed the help. If you were intelligent, well-spoken, and possessed the unusual ability to remember an absurd number of noble family connections, becoming a herald was one of the most fascinating careers in Tudor England. It was also one of the few jobs where knowing who someone's great-grandfather married could actually advance your career. For most people, family history was fairly simple. Your father was a farmer. His father was a farmer, and unless something went terribly wrong, you would probably become a farmer too. The nobility, however, approached family history differently. Every marriage, title, inheritance, coat of arms, and distant cousin mattered a great deal. Entire fortunes could depend on proving who was related to whom. Entire lawsuits could revolve around which nobleman had the stronger claim to a title. And occasionally, entire wars had begun over arguments that a herald would find professionally interesting. This made heralds extremely valuable. They were experts in genealogy, heraldry, noble lineages, ceremonies, and royal protocol. They maintained records, verified family claims, organised state occasions, and advised powerful individuals on matters of rank and status. Think of them as part historian, part lawyer, part event planner, and part walking encyclopedia, except with significantly more colourful clothing. Heralds were easy to recognise. They often wore elaborate tabards decorated with royal arms and symbols. During important ceremonies, they stood out immediately, which was fortunate. After all, if your job involves announcing kings, noblemen, and ambassadors, it helps if people can identify you before you begin shouting. The profession carried considerable prestige. Heralds attended coronations, royal weddings, state funerals, diplomatic events, tournaments, and major public ceremonies. While ordinary citizens watched history happen from the crowd, heralds often stood directly in the middle of it. They announced important visitors, delivered royal messages, and ensured that complicated ceremonies unfolded correctly. Because if there is one thing nobles throughout history have loved, it is complicated ceremonies. The job also offered excellent opportunities for advancement. Experienced heralds became respected authorities whose opinions could influence inheritance disputes and questions of noble status. People listened when they spoke, mostly because nobody else could remember 7 generations of aristocratic family connections without consulting notes. Of course, the profession was not entirely free of challenges. You needed an exceptional memory. You needed diplomatic skills. And you needed the patience to listen to wealthy people explain why their family was more important than everyone else's, repeatedly. Still, compared to the average Tudor occupation, it was a remarkably attractive career. You worked with knowledge rather than muscle. You travelled. You attended great ceremonies. And you got paid to know things. In Tudor England, that was a surprisingly rare and valuable talent, especially when those things involved determining which nobleman's great-uncle had inherited a castle 3 generations ago and why everyone was still arguing about it. If you asked a Tudor peasant to describe the most powerful man in England, he would probably say the king, and he would be correct. But if you asked a clever courtier who had spent years navigating royal politics, he might give a different answer. He might point toward the man standing quietly beside the king. The gentleman of the Privy Chamber held one of the most coveted positions in Tudor England because he enjoyed something that everyone wanted and almost nobody possessed. Access. Direct, personal, daily access to the monarch. In a kingdom where fortunes could be made or destroyed by a single royal decision, that was an extraordinary advantage. The Privy Chamber was the king's private world. It was where he slept, where he dressed, where he relaxed, where he spoke openly with trusted companions, and where important discussions often occurred away from the formal ceremonies of court. The gentlemen who served there became far more than servants. Many became confidants, advisors, friends, and political allies. Unlike ambassadors who waited weeks for an audience or noblemen who competed desperately for attention, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber might see the king several times a day. Imagine having easier access to Henry VIII than many of England's most powerful nobles. That alone made the position enormously influential. The duties themselves were often surprisingly ordinary. You helped manage the king's private apartments. You assisted with daily routines. You organised personal matters. You ensured that the monarch's private household functioned smoothly. None of these tasks sound particularly glamorous, yet because they occurred within the king's inner circle, they carried tremendous significance. Court politics often revolved around proximity. Who could speak with the king? Who could influence his opinions? Who could present information before anyone else? Gentlemen of the Privy Chamber enjoyed advantages in all three areas. Many accumulated wealth, lands, offices, and political influence simply because they were trusted members of the king's private household. Some became among the most powerful figures in England. Not bad for a job that occasionally involved helping someone get dressed. Of course, there were risks. This was Tudor politics, a place where today's favourite could become tomorrow's prisoner with alarming speed. If the king fell out with you, the consequences could be severe. If your political allies lost influence, you might lose influence as well. And if you found yourself associated with the wrong faction at court, your career could disappear overnight, possibly along with your head. Still, compared to most occupations, the rewards were remarkable. You lived comfortably. You enjoyed prestige. You gained influence. And you operated at the very centre of English power. In Tudor England, few jobs offered greater opportunities. After all, when the most powerful man in the kingdom considers you part of his inner circle, doors tend to open. Sometimes entire castles open. Sometimes entire careers. And occasionally entire kingdoms seem to move in your direction. If there was one man in Tudor England whose job description essentially read, "Make sure everyone has a good time," it was the Master of Revels. At first glance, it sounds like a completely invented position. The Master of Revels. It sounds less like a government official and more like someone who accidentally became king of a particularly enthusiastic tavern. Yet the position was very real and surprisingly important. The Tudor court loved entertainment. There were banquets, festivals, masques, plays, tournaments, holiday celebrations, diplomatic receptions, and endless opportunities for wealthy people to show off how wealthy they were. Someone had to organise all of it. That someone was the Master of Revels. His responsibilities included arranging court entertainments, hiring performers, managing costumes, overseeing stage productions, and ensuring that major celebrations unfolded smoothly. Imagine organising the largest parties in England. Now imagine doing it for people who could spend more money on a single evening's entertainment than an entire village might see in years. The pressure was considerable. The rewards were even better. The Master of Revels worked directly with royalty. He interacted with playwrights, actors, musicians, artists, craftsmen, and nobles. He stood at the centre of England's growing entertainment industry, long before anyone knew what an entertainment industry was. As theatre became increasingly popular during the reign of Elizabeth I, the office gained even more importance. Eventually, the Master of Revels became responsible for approving plays before they could be performed publicly, which effectively made him England's most powerful theatre critic. If he approved your play, audiences could see it. If he did not approve your play, audiences could not see it. Simple. Playwrights quickly learned that making enemies of him was not an excellent career strategy. This gave the office tremendous influence. Writers, actors, and theatre companies all depended on his decisions. In a strange way, he became one of the earliest regulators of popular entertainment, a job that remains unpopular centuries later. Of course, the work was not entirely glamorous. Managing large events is difficult in any century. Managing large events in Tudor England was even harder. Costumes got lost, performers made mistakes, weather disrupted plans, nobles developed unrealistic expectations, and somebody was always asking for something impossible at the last minute. Some traditions never change. Still, compared to most Tudor occupations, the Master of Revels had a remarkably enjoyable career. He attended grand celebrations, worked with creative people, enjoyed royal patronage, and spent his days planning entertainment rather than harvesting cabbages. In an age filled with hard labour, political intrigue, and frequent outbreaks of misery, being paid to organise England's biggest parties was a surprisingly attractive way to earn a living, especially when everyone else had to work while you were technically getting paid to celebrate. If you possessed intelligence, confidence, and absolutely no fear of making predictions that powerful people might later remember, becoming a royal astrologer could be one of the most fascinating careers in Tudor England. Today, If someone told a government leader that the position of Mars suggested caution regarding foreign policy, they would probably be ignored. In Tudor England, they might receive a royal pension. Astrology was taken remarkably seriously. Kings, queens, nobles and wealthy merchants often consulted astrologers before making important decisions. They wanted advice about marriages, voyages, investments, illnesses, political events, and occasionally whether a particular day was suitable for doing almost anything. The stars apparently had opinions on everything. A royal astrologer occupied a unique position at court. He was expected to study planetary movements, create elaborate charts, calculate favourable dates, and provide guidance to important clients. Some astrologers also practiced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. In fact, many were among the most educated individuals in England. The most famous example was John Dee, who served as an advisor to Elizabeth I. Dee was a mathematician, scholar, navigator, and astrologer whose library was one of the largest in the kingdom. To ordinary people, he probably looked like a wizard. To be fair, he occasionally looked like a wizard to other scholars as well. The position offered remarkable advantages. Royal patrons paid generously. Nobles sought your advice. Important figures visited your chambers. And unlike many professions, your tools consisted primarily of books, charts, and calculations, rather than heavy objects designed to injure your back. You also enjoyed something many people desperately wanted: mystery. A blacksmith might impress people with his craftsmanship. An astrologer impressed people by appearing to possess secret knowledge about the universe. Humans have always found that difficult to resist. Of course, the profession came with risks. Predictions could be wrong, very wrong. A voyage expected to succeed might fail. A marriage predicted to prosper might become a disaster. A political forecast could age badly with remarkable speed. Fortunately, astrologers developed a skill that remains common among experts today: the ability to explain why events had unfolded differently than expected. Still, compared with most Tudor occupations, the role remained highly desirable. You worked indoors. You enjoyed prestige. You interacted with powerful people. And your daily routine involved studying the heavens rather than shoveling manure. In a society where many careers depended entirely on physical labour, the royal astrologer earned his living through intellect, reputation, and a convincing understanding of stars that nobody else could properly verify. Not a bad arrangement, especially when your office was considerably warmer than a field in January. If you wanted a comfortable, respected position at court that involved very little risk of being chased by angry animals, or accidentally losing a finger to medieval medical procedures, becoming the keeper of the king's wine cellar was an excellent choice. After all, somebody had to manage the royal wine supply. And the Tudors took their wine very seriously. Extremely seriously. In fact, wine was consumed at nearly every level of society. The wealthy drank large quantities of imported wines from France, Spain, Germany, and Italy. At court, enormous amounts were consumed during banquets, celebrations, diplomatic receptions, and ordinary meals. The royal household could go through staggering quantities every year. This meant the king's cellar was not simply a storage room, it was practically a strategic resource. The keeper of the wine cellar oversaw inventories, managed deliveries, monitored quality, organised storage, and ensured that the right wines appeared at the right events. This required far more skill than it might sound. Wine was expensive. Imported wine was even more expensive. And spoiled wine represented a financial disaster, particularly when the customer happened to be the king. Imagine explaining to Henry VIII that several barrels of valuable wine had gone bad because someone failed to monitor storage conditions. That conversation would likely become the worst part of your week. The position also offered excellent opportunities for advancement. The royal household depended on trusted officials to manage valuable resources. A reliable cellar keeper handled goods worth enormous sums of money. Trust was everything. If the king trusted you with his wine, he often trusted you with other responsibilities as well. And unlike many court officials, your duties brought you into contact with almost everyone. Nobles attended banquets. Foreign ambassadors attended banquets. Royal visitors attended banquets. The one thing they all had in common was an interest in what was being served to drink, which meant the cellar keeper quietly occupied an important position behind countless political and diplomatic gatherings. Of course, the work was not entirely free from challenges. Shipments could be delayed. Barrels could leak. supplies could run low, and court celebrations occasionally consumed wine at a rate that suggested tomorrow was not guaranteed. Still, compared to most Tudor occupations, the advantages were extraordinary. You worked indoors. You enjoyed royal patronage. You managed valuable imports. You avoided back-breaking labour. And your workplace happened to contain some of the finest wines in Europe. For a Tudor citizen, that was about as good as employment could get. While millions of people spent their lives struggling through hard physical labour, you spent yours surrounded by barrels of imported wine, trusted by kings, and attending some of the grandest events in England. Not a bad career, though historians have never fully determined how much of the inventory was lost to evaporation and how much was lost to quality control inspections conducted by the keeper himself. Long before protein shakes, energy gels, and fitness influencers explaining the secrets of human performance while standing in front of rented sports cars, ancient athletes were trying to answer the same question everyone asks today. What should I eat if I want to be stronger than the other guy? The earliest Greek athletes had surprisingly simple answers. If you travelled to a training ground in Greece around the 7th or 6th century before Christ, you would not find tables covered with mountains of meat. Instead, many athletes lived on foods that would look more appropriate for a hard-working farmer than a future Olympic champion. Their meals often consisted of barley bread, cheese, figs, olives, and wine diluted with water. Barley was especially important. It was cheap, widely available, and packed with energy. Athletes consumed it in various forms, including thick barley porridge that could keep them full through hours of training. It was not glamorous, but then neither was being punched in the face repeatedly during boxing practice. The Greek physician Galen later wrote extensively about athletic diets and training methods. According to various ancient sources, early athletes were believed to benefit from moderation. Excessive eating was often viewed as harmful. The ideal competitor needed strength, but also speed, endurance, and self-discipline. Greek trainers paid close attention to routine. Athletes followed strict schedules for eating, sleeping, exercising, and bathing. The body was viewed as something that could be carefully shaped through habit and discipline. In many ways, ancient coaches were already experimenting with sports science, even if their laboratories mostly consisted of dusty fields and men arguing loudly about philosophy. The training centres, known as gymnasia, became places where nutrition and exercise went hand in hand. Young competitors learned that victory was not won only during competition. It was built gradually through daily choices. Every meal was considered part of preparation. Of course, athletes still searched for shortcuts. Human nature has always remained wonderfully consistent. Give people a competition, and sooner or later, someone will start asking whether eating 3 times as much cheese might somehow create 3 times as much muscle. For the moment, however, simple foods remained king. Bread, fruit, cheese, and olives fueled generations of competitors who ran races, wrestled opponents, and competed in the earliest Olympic Games. But this modest diet would not last forever. Soon, a new idea would spread through the Greek world. If ordinary men ate ordinary food, perhaps champions needed something much more extreme. The simple diet of bread, figs, cheese, and olives worked well enough for generations of Greek athletes, but eventually, someone looked at a particularly large wrestler and reached a conclusion that has echoed throughout fitness culture for thousands of years. Big muscles must come from eating big things. And what was bigger than meat? By the 5th century before Christ, many athletes began abandoning the older, lighter diets in favour of large quantities of animal flesh. Wrestlers, boxers, and pankration fighters especially embraced the trend. Pankration, for the record, was a sport that combined wrestling and boxing with very few rules. Imagine a sporting event designed by people who thought safety regulations were a sign of personal weakness. One of the most famous examples was Milo of Croton, the legendary wrestler whose appetite became almost as famous as his victories. Ancient stories claimed Milo consumed enormous amounts of food every day. Some accounts describe him eating massive portions of meat, bread, and wine that would make a modern nutritionist faint onto the nearest clipboard. Whether these stories were exaggerated is difficult to know. Ancient writers loved turning successful athletes into larger-than-life heroes. Still, the underlying belief was clear. Strength came from meat. Many trainers argued that animal flesh transferred power directly to the body. If a bull was strong, then eating beef might make a man stronger. If a goat was energetic, perhaps goat meat carried some of that vitality. The scientific method had not quite arrived yet, so theories often sounded suspiciously like things people invented during lunch. Athletes preparing for major competitions consumed increasingly heavy diets. Some focused almost entirely on meat. Others combined it with large amounts of bread and wine to sustain long training sessions. Not everyone approved. Certain physicians warned that excessive meat consumption could create digestive problems and sluggishness. A wrestler might develop impressive muscles, but if he spent half the afternoon regretting his lunch, his competitive advantages became somewhat limited. This disagreement created one of history's earliest debates about sports nutrition. Should athletes prioritize strength or balance? Should they eat heavily to build muscle, or moderately to maintain endurance? Sound familiar? More than 2,000 years later, people still argue about exactly the same thing. Only now the debate takes place on podcasts instead of in Greek gymnasia. As meat became increasingly associated with athletic success, competitors continued searching for even more powerful ways to improve performance. Soon, some would turn to remedies that seem strange even by ancient standards, including drinks made from ash, which, surprisingly, was considered a serious nutritional strategy rather than evidence of a kitchen accident. As meat became the fashionable fuel of champions, athletes continued searching for anything that might provide an extra advantage. Winning at Olympia could bring fame, wealth, statues, and enough bragging rights to last several generations. Naturally, competitors became willing to try almost anything. This is where sports nutrition starts becoming wonderfully strange. Among the remedies mentioned by ancient writers were drinks containing ash. Yes, actual ash. The same substance left behind after burning wood. At some point, someone looked into a fireplace and thought, perhaps this belongs inside my body. According to ancient sources, certain athletes consumed mixtures containing ash, herbs, wine, and various minerals. These concoctions were believed to strengthen the body, improve recovery, and replace substances lost during intense exercise. To be fair, ancient athletes did not fully understand what minerals were or how the human body used them. They simply noticed that certain remedies seemed helpful and built theories around those observations. Sometimes they were completely wrong. Occasionally they stumbled onto something surprisingly useful. Wood ash contains small amounts of minerals such as calcium and potassium. Ancient people did not know the chemical details, but they understood that ash could have medicinal applications. It was used in everything from wound treatment to digestive remedies. Athletes took these ideas and adapted them to training. The exact recipes varied from region to region. Some mixtures combined ash with wine. Others included crushed herbs or plant extracts. A trainer might swear by one formula, while another insisted his rival's recipe was complete nonsense. Fitness experts arguing over supplements is apparently one of humanity's oldest traditions. The challenge was separating genuine benefits from superstition. Ancient medicine was based on theories about balancing bodily humours. If an athlete felt weak, tired, or sore after training, physicians often prescribed remedies designed to restore harmony within the body. Ash-based drinks sometimes found their way into these treatments. Recovery itself was becoming a major concern. Competitors trained harder than ever before, especially in combat sports. Wrestlers could spend hours grappling under the Mediterranean sun. Boxers absorbed repeated blows to the head. Pancration fighters experienced a level of physical punishment that would make modern insurance companies immediately leave the conversation. The question was no longer simply how to become stronger. The question was how to recover fast enough to train again tomorrow. Ash drinks represented one attempt to solve that problem. Whether they truly worked remains debatable. What is certain is that athletes were already experimenting with performance enhancement centuries before modern science appeared. And while drinking ash may sound odd today, some of the recovery foods they trusted next were far more appetizing. At least most of them were. Some Roman athletes still managed to surprise people with their dietary choices. Drinking ash might have sounded impressive in theory, but when it came to recovery, ancient athletes often preferred something far more practical. Food, after all. A wrestler who had spent hours being thrown into the dirt needed more than philosophical discussions about bodily humours. He needed dinner. Recovery was a serious concern throughout the ancient world. Greek and Roman athletes trained relentlessly, especially those competing in combat sports. Bruises, muscle soreness, joint pain, and exhaustion were considered normal parts of life. The challenge was finding ways to repair the body quickly enough to continue training. Many athletes turned to foods rich in fats and proteins. Cheese remained a favourite, particularly among Greek competitors. It was portable, calorie-dense, and widely available. Some physicians believed it helped rebuild strength after strenuous exercise. Milk also played a role in recovery diets. Fresh milk was often consumed after training sessions, especially in rural areas where livestock were common. Ancient doctors sometimes prescribed dairy products to athletes recovering from injuries or illness. Then there were eggs. While not as heavily emphasized as in modern fitness culture, eggs were appreciated as a nutritious food source. They were relatively easy to obtain and packed with energy. An athlete could eat several eggs after training and feel considerably better than someone surviving on barley alone. Roman athletes expanded these ideas even further. By the imperial period, successful competitors often had access to specialized diets, supervised by trainers, physicians, and wealthy sponsors. Some athletes consumed large quantities of meat, cheese, eggs, and fish, specifically for recovery purposes. Fish was particularly valued in coastal regions. It provided protein while being easier to digest than some heavier meats. Ancient medical writers frequently praised fish as a healthy option for maintaining physical condition. Of course, recovery meals were not always based on sound science. Some physicians recommended specific foods according to a person's temperament. Others believed certain foods could transfer qualities directly to the body. Strong animals supposedly created strong athletes. Fast animals might contribute speed. By this logic, eating a particularly energetic rooster may have seemed like an excellent training strategy. The evidence supporting such theories was, unsurprisingly, somewhat limited. Still, many recovery foods were genuinely beneficial. Cheese, milk, fish, eggs, and meat all provided nutrients that helped support muscle repair and energy restoration. Without understanding proteins, amino acids, or metabolism, ancient athletes had stumbled onto several effective recovery practices simply through experience. But food was only part of the equation. Roman trainers soon became obsessed with another ingredient they believed was essential for strength, endurance, and recovery: wine. And unlike modern sports drinks, Roman athletes often consumed quite a lot of it. If a modern coach handed athletes unlimited wine as part of their performance program, there would probably be several meetings, multiple investigations, and at least one very confused nutrition department. In the ancient world, however, wine was considered a perfectly reasonable component of an athlete's diet. The important detail is that Greeks and Romans rarely drank it straight. Undiluted wine was generally viewed as excessive, uncivilized, or simply foolish. Instead, wine was usually mixed with water, often in ratios that varied depending on the occasion. The result was a beverage that provided hydration, calories, and a small amount of alcohol, without immediately turning a training session into a public disaster. Athletes consumed diluted wine throughout Greece and Rome. It accompanied meals, aided digestion, and was frequently recommended by physicians. Some doctors believed wine could stimulate circulation, improve appetite, and help the body recover after physical exertion. Others prescribed specific wines for specific conditions. A tired athlete might receive one variety, an injured athlete another. Some physicians wrote lengthy discussions about which wines were warming, cooling, drying, or moistening. Reading ancient medical texts sometimes feels less like studying nutrition, and more like listening to someone describe weather patterns inside the human body. Nevertheless, wine served practical purposes. Unlike many water sources, which could be contaminated, wine mixtures were often safer to consume. They also provided energy through natural sugars. During periods of intense training, those extra calories were valuable. Roman gladiators were particularly familiar with this reality. Although not athletes in the Olympic sense, gladiators trained under rigorous physical conditions. They consumed large amounts of food and drink to sustain their demanding routines. Ancient writers frequently mention their reliance on grain-based diets and beverages that helped maintain energy reserves. Some trainers believed wine improved endurance. Others argued it reduced pain and accelerated recovery. After a day of wrestling, boxing, or running under the Mediterranean sun, many athletes were willing to believe almost anything that promised relief. Of course, moderation remained important. Even ancient writers understood that excessive drinking could destroy performance. A champion who arrived at competition barely able to stand upright was unlikely to impress judges, spectators, or opponents. This created a balance. Wine was useful, but only in controlled amounts. At least that was the theory. In practice, human beings have always been remarkably talented at turning moderation into excess. Still, compared to some of the other nutritional experiments taking place across the Roman world, diluted wine was relatively sensible. The next generation of trainers would become fascinated by something even more ambitious. The idea that specific foods could literally build certain types of strength, transforming ordinary men into living symbols of power. By the Roman period, sports nutrition had evolved far beyond simple questions of calories and recovery. Athletes, trainers, and physicians increasingly believed that certain foods possessed special qualities that could be transferred directly into the human body. The theory was simple. If an animal was strong, eating that animal might make you strong. If an animal was fast, perhaps some of that speed could be borrowed. If an animal was fierce, courageous, or resilient, then consuming its flesh might help cultivate those same traits. To modern ears, this sounds less like nutrition and more like magical thinking. But for much of ancient history, it was a perfectly respectable idea. The ancient world lacked microscopes, laboratories, and nutrition science. People understood the world through observation. A bull was obviously powerful. A deer was obviously swift. Therefore, it seemed reasonable to assume their physical qualities came from something inside them. And if that something could be eaten, why not take advantage of it? Athletes often favoured beef because cattle symbolised raw strength. Wrestlers and fighters especially valued it. A man preparing to throw opponents around an arena naturally found comfort in the idea that he was fueling himself with the muscle of one of the strongest animals available. Goat meat also enjoyed a strong reputation. Goats were known for their endurance, agility, and ability to navigate difficult terrain. Trainers sometimes viewed them as models of toughness. Even birds found their way into these theories. Roosters, famous for aggression and relentless energy, were occasionally associated with fighting spirit. It was easy to imagine a boxer convincing himself that eating a particularly combative rooster would somehow improve tomorrow's match. Whether the rooster agreed with this arrangement remains unrecorded. Roman physicians often blended these beliefs with medical theory. Certain meats were considered warming, while others were thought to cool the body. Some promoted strength. Others supposedly increased endurance or accelerated healing. Athletes carefully selected foods according to their training goals. At least they tried to. The reality was often far less scientific. Sometimes a champion succeeded after eating a particular food, and suddenly everyone wanted the same meal. Correlation became causation with remarkable speed. Human beings have always been vulnerable to this kind of thinking. Even today, if a famous athlete claims success came from eating a specific food every morning, thousands of people immediately start shopping for it. Ancient athletes were no different. Yet despite all the myths and assumptions, some competitors were becoming surprisingly sophisticated in their understanding of diet. They were beginning to recognize that food affected body composition itself, and nowhere was that idea more visible than among Rome's most famous professional fighters, the gladiators. When most people imagine Roman gladiators, they picture towering warriors devouring endless mountains of meat before charging into the arena. The reality was far stranger. Many gladiators ate a diet that was overwhelmingly based on plants. In fact, ancient writers sometimes referred to gladiators as hordearii, meaning barley men. It was not exactly the intimidating nickname one might expect from professional fighters. Imagine introducing the heavyweight champion of the world as the oatmeal guy. Yet there was a reason for it. Gladiators consumed enormous amounts of barley, beans, lentils, and other grains. Their meals were designed not just to build strength, but also to create a specific body type. Unlike modern athletes chasing visible abdominal muscles, gladiators often benefited from carrying an extra layer of body fat. That fat acted as a form of protection. A superficial cut from a blade would be less likely to reach vital organs if there was a cushion of tissue beneath the skin. Arena doctors could treat dramatic-looking wounds that entertained spectators while allowing the fighter to survive and compete again. The crowd saw blood. The gladiator saw job security. Modern archaeological studies of gladiator remains have provided fascinating evidence supporting ancient descriptions. Bone analysis suggests many gladiators consumed large quantities of plant-based foods, especially barley and legumes. This does not mean they never ate meat. They certainly did when available. However, meat was often expensive, while grains and beans could feed large training schools far more efficiently. A gladiator school owner had to think like a businessman. Feeding hundreds of fighters steaks every day would have been financially painful. Barley offered a practical solution. It was cheap, filling, and packed with carbohydrates that fueled intense physical training. Beans and lentils supplied additional nutrients and protein. Combined together, they created a surprisingly effective athletic diet. But perhaps the most unusual part came after training. Ancient sources describe gladiators consuming beverages made from plant ash. There it was again. Ash, the same substance that appeared earlier in Greek athletic traditions, had found a place in Roman gladiator schools as well. Historians believe these ash drinks may have provided calcium and other minerals important for bone health and recovery. Without understanding chemistry, trainers had accidentally stumbled upon a crude mineral supplement. Not bad for people who thought the best medical treatment sometimes involved balancing invisible bodily humours. The gladiator diet demonstrates an important lesson. Ancient athletes were often far more practical than we assume, and nowhere was that practicality more obvious than in the recovery methods Roman trainers developed for keeping battered fighters alive, healthy, and ready for the next spectacle. Training was only half the battle in the ancient world. The other half was waking up the next morning and discovering that your shoulders, knees, ribs, and back still functioned. For Roman athletes and gladiators, recovery was not a luxury. It was survival. A fighter who could recover quickly could train more often. A fighter who recovered slowly risked falling behind, losing competitions, or, in the case of gladiators, becoming a very brief historical footnote. Roman trainers therefore developed entire systems dedicated to helping athletes bounce back from punishment. One of the most important tools was massage. Professional trainers and attendants worked sore muscles after training sessions, using oils to reduce stiffness and improve circulation. Athletes were rubbed down so regularly that some spent almost as much time being massaged as they did exercising. This probably sounded much more glamorous than it actually was. Most sessions involved someone aggressively pressing into bruised muscles while assuring the athlete that the pain was beneficial. Then came bathing. Roman bathhouses were not simply places to get clean. They functioned as recovery centres. Athletes moved through warm rooms, hot baths, steam chambers and cold plunges. The process helped relax muscles, improve mobility, and reduce soreness. Modern athletes spend thousands of dollars trying to replicate similar recovery routines. The Romans simply built enormous public facilities and invited half the city. Of course, food remained central to recovery. After intense exercise, athletes consumed large meals designed to restore energy reserves. Barley, beans, bread, fish, cheese, eggs, and meat all played important roles depending on the athlete's status and financial resources. Physicians often prescribed specific recovery foods based on injuries. A bruised fighter might receive one dietary recommendation. Someone recovering from exhaustion might receive another. Whether these treatments actually worked varied considerably. Ancient medicine often mixed practical observation with pure speculation. A doctor could correctly recommend nutritious food and proper rest, then immediately suggest a remedy involving mysterious bodily vapours that sounded like something invented during a fever dream. Sleep was another critical component. Roman writers repeatedly emphasized the importance of adequate rest. Athletes were encouraged to follow disciplined schedules, avoiding excessive drinking, late-night celebrations, and other distractions. Not every athlete followed this advice, naturally. Human beings have been ignoring good recovery advice for thousands of years with remarkable consistency. Yet despite the occasional mistake, Roman trainers understood something important. Performance was not built solely during training. It was built during recovery. The strongest athlete was not necessarily the one who trained the hardest. Sometimes it was the one who recovered the smartest. And that realization would eventually lead ancient sports nutrition toward its ultimate goal, creating the perfect formula for strength itself. A goal that fascinated athletes from Greece to Rome, even if they never fully agreed on what that formula actually was. After centuries of experimentation, debate, and more than a few questionable drinks, ancient athletes were still chasing the same goal that drives sports nutrition today. They wanted the perfect formula, the meal that would make them stronger, the drink that would help them recover faster, the secret advantage that would separate champions from everyone else. From the training grounds of Greece to the gladiator schools of Rome, countless athletes searched for answers. Some swore by meat, others trusted barley, some praised cheese and milk, others relied on wine, beans, fish, or mineral-rich ash drinks. Everyone had a theory, and everyone was convinced their theory was correct. Greek wrestlers argued over the benefits of heavy meat consumption. Physicians warned against excess. Gladiator trainers built entire programs around grains and legumes. Medical writers filled scrolls with recommendations that ranged from surprisingly sensible to wonderfully bizarre. What makes all of this fascinating is how familiar it feels. Modern athletes debate high-protein diets, low-carbohydrate diets, fasting protocols, supplements, recovery shakes, electrolyte formulas, and countless other approaches. Social media is filled with experts explaining the one secret everyone else supposedly missed. Ancient athletes would have understood immediately. They lived in a world overflowing with nutritional advice. The technology was different. Human nature was exactly the same. Despite their mistakes, many ancient athletes arrived at conclusions that modern science would eventually support. They recognized the importance of consistent nutrition. They understood that recovery mattered. They valued hydration, rest, and proper training schedules. They experimented with foods rich in energy and nutrients, not bad for people who had never heard the words protein, carbohydrate, calorie, or vitamin. Of course, they also drank ash. No historical period gets everything right. Yet perhaps that is what makes ancient sports nutrition so interesting. It sits at the crossroads between observation and superstition, experience and guesswork, practical wisdom and outright nonsense. Some ideas failed completely. Others survived for thousands of years. The athletes themselves continued pushing their bodies to the limit, searching for strength in every meal and every remedy. Whether competing at Olympia, wrestling in a Greek gymnasium, or fighting beneath the roar of a Roman crowd, they all shared the same hope, that tomorrow they would be a little stronger than they were today. And in many ways, that simple goal connects every athlete across history. The supplements have changed, the gym equipment has changed, the science has changed, but the dream remains exactly the same, to find that elusive edge that turns effort into greatness and transforms ordinary competitors into legends. Long before anyone ran from Marathon to Athens, before legends blurred into history, and before one battle became famous enough to inspire a race thousands of years later, there was an empire so vast that most Greeks could barely comprehend its size. It was the Persian Empire. By the early 5th century before Christ, the Persian kings ruled lands stretching from modern-day Egypt to the borders of India. Their armies marched across deserts, mountains, forests, and rivers. Their subjects spoke dozens of languages and worshipped countless gods. Compared to Persia, the Greek world looked tiny. The Greeks themselves were not one united nation. They lived in hundreds of independent city-states scattered across the mainland, islands, and coastlines of the Aegean Sea. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and countless others spent nearly as much time arguing with each other as they did worrying about foreign threats. If there had been an Olympic event for political squabbling, the Greeks would have dominated it. Meanwhile, Persia continued growing. The empire had been built by powerful rulers such as Cyrus the Great and expanded further under Darius I. Darius was ambitious, organised, and determined to strengthen Persian control wherever possible. He governed one of the largest empires the world had ever seen, and possessed resources that Greek cities could only dream about. Many Greek communities along the western coast of Asia Minor had already fallen under Persian authority. These cities retained some local freedoms, but ultimately they answered to Persian governors and Persian power. Not everyone was happy about that arrangement. Among the Greeks, independence was deeply valued. The idea of answering to a distant king across the sea felt uncomfortable, especially for people accustomed to managing their own affairs. Tensions simmered for years as resentment toward Persian rule quietly grew. Athens watched these developments with increasing concern. The city was still developing its democratic institutions and beginning to emerge as a significant power in Greece. Its citizens were proud of their freedoms and fiercely protective of their autonomy. The prospect of Persian influence reaching the Greek mainland alarmed many Athenians. At first, war seemed unlikely. The distance between Athens and the Persian heartland was enormous. The empire had countless other concerns. Most Greeks probably assumed Persia would remain a distant giant on the horizon. History, however, has a habit of bringing distant giants much closer than expected, and soon a rebellion in the Persian-controlled Greek cities would ignite a chain of events that neither Athens nor Persia could easily stop. The Persian Empire may have appeared unstoppable, but empires often discover that conquering territory is easier than keeping everyone happy afterward. The trouble began in Ionia, a region along the western coast of Asia Minor, where many Greek cities had fallen under Persian control. Cities such as Miletus, Ephesus, and others remained Greek in language, culture, and traditions, but politically they answered to Persia. For a while, the arrangement worked. Persian rulers generally allowed conquered peoples to keep their customs, religions, and local governments. Compared to many ancient empires, Persia could be surprisingly practical. As long as taxes were paid and loyalty maintained, the great king was often willing to leave local affairs alone. Unfortunately, there was one flaw in the system. Greeks had a remarkable talent for disliking anyone who told them what to do. By 499 before Christ, dissatisfaction had reached a boiling point. A local ruler named Aristagoras of Miletus found himself in political trouble after a failed military expedition. Rather than quietly accepting responsibility, he chose a strategy that remains popular among politicians throughout history. He blamed someone else. More specifically, he encouraged rebellion against Persian authority. Soon, cities across Ionia joined the revolt. Persian officials were expelled, governments were overthrown, and for the first time, the mighty empire faced a coordinated uprising from its Greek subjects. The rebels desperately needed help. Unfortunately for them, most Greek cities showed little interest in volunteering. Supporting a rebellion against the largest empire on earth sounded heroic in theory. In practice, it sounded like an excellent way to become conquered. Athens, however, decided differently. The Athenians sent ships and soldiers to aid their fellow Greeks across the sea. The contribution was relatively small, but its impact would be enormous. Together, the rebels and their allies launched a bold attack on Sardis, one of the most important Persian administrative centres in the region. During the assault, much of the city caught fire. To the Greeks, it was a dramatic victory. To the Persians, it was an insult. King Darius reportedly reacted with particular anger when he learned that Athens had participated. According to later accounts, he ordered a servant to remind him daily of the city's existence. "Master, remember the Athenians." It was the ancient equivalent of keeping someone's name on a very large and very dangerous to-do list. The revolt itself would eventually fail. Persian armies gradually crushed the rebellion city by city. By 494 before Christ, the great city of Miletus had fallen, and Persian authority was restored. But the damage had already been done. Athens had attracted the attention of the most powerful ruler in the world, and King Darius had every intention of settling the score. The Ionian revolt was over. The rebellious cities had been defeated. Persian authority had been restored. From a practical perspective, the crisis was finished. But King Darius was not interested in practical perspectives. He remembered Sardis. He remembered the burning buildings, and most importantly, he remembered the Athenians. For the Persian king, this was no longer merely about suppressing a rebellion. It was about demonstrating that no city, however distant, could interfere in Persian affairs without consequences. If Athens escaped punishment, other subjects might get dangerous ideas. Empires dislike dangerous ideas. The first Persian attempt to reach Greece came in 492 before Christ. A large force moved toward the Greek mainland, but nature intervened. A violent storm wrecked much of the Persian fleet near Mount Athos, destroying hundreds of ships. It was an embarrassing setback. Imagine spending years planning an invasion only to have the weather file a formal objection. Darius, however, was not discouraged. 2 years later, a second expedition was organised. This time the Persians carefully crossed the Aegean, capturing islands and demanding submission from Greek cities along the way. Many communities complied. The Persian Empire had a terrifying reputation, and resistance seemed pointless. Why challenge the largest empire on earth when surrender might spare your city from destruction? Some Greek states chose caution. Athens did not. As the Persian fleet advanced across the sea in 490 before Christ, thousands of soldiers sailed toward the eastern coast of Attica. Their destination was a broad coastal plain known as Marathon. The location was ideal. The flat terrain provided space for cavalry operations and offered an excellent landing site for the Persian army. It was close enough to Athens to threaten the city directly, but far enough away to establish a secure base of operations. Soon Persian ships began arriving, soldiers disembarked onto the plain, campfires appeared across the landscape. The invasion had begun. News travelled quickly to Athens. The city erupted into alarm. Citizens understood the danger immediately. This was not a border dispute or a small raid. A powerful foreign army had landed on Athenian soil. The future of the city itself might be decided within days. Athens responded with remarkable speed. Messengers raced across Greece seeking allies. Most importantly, a runner named Phidippides was sent to Sparta to request military assistance. The journey covered well over 100 miles through rugged terrain. Ironically, this extraordinary run is often overshadowed by another run that may or may not have happened later. Meanwhile, Athenian forces marched out to Marathon. They could not allow the Persians to advance unopposed toward the city. Yet standing between Athens and the might of Persia was a frightening prospect. The Athenians had reached Marathon. Now they had to decide whether to fight. The Athenians had reached Marathon. Across the plain stood the army of the Persian Empire. Behind them lay Athens itself. There was no comfortable middle ground. The Athenian force established a position near the hills overlooking the plain. The location offered some protection and allowed them to observe Persian movements. For several tense days, neither side launched a major attack. Instead, they watched and waited. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part. Every sunrise brought the possibility of battle. Every sunset brought uncertainty. The Persians possessed larger numbers and a fearsome reputation. Many Athenians had never faced an enemy on such a scale before. Inside the Greek camp, a fierce debate began. Athens had 10 elected generals, one from each tribe of the city. In theory, this system spread responsibility. In practice, it gave 10 intelligent, ambitious men an opportunity to disagree with one another. Some commanders believed they should attack immediately. Others argued for caution. The risks were enormous. If the Athenians charged onto the plain and lost, the road to Athens would be wide open. The city could be captured, its democracy destroyed, and its citizens subjected to Persian rule. On the other hand, waiting carried dangers as well. The Persians might receive reinforcements. Their cavalry could become even more effective. Worse still, they might sail directly toward Athens while the Greek army remained stranded at Marathon. Every option seemed dangerous. The arguments grew increasingly intense. At the centre of this crisis stood a man named Miltiades. Unlike many of his colleagues, Miltiades understood the Persians unusually well. He had spent years living near Persian-controlled territories and knew something of their strengths and weaknesses. While others hesitated, he pushed aggressively for battle. Miltiades believed delay favoured Persia. The Athenians, he argued, possessed advantages of their own. Their hoplites were heavily armoured citizens trained to fight in close formation. If they struck decisively, they might have a chance, but only if they acted. According to later accounts, the generals eventually split evenly on the question. 5 favoured battle, 5 favoured caution. The decision may have come down to Callimachus, the polemarch, a senior military official whose vote would break the deadlock. Miltiades appealed directly to him. The fate of Athens, he argued, rested on the choice he was about to make. Victory could preserve the city and its freedom. Defeat would bring consequences too grim to contemplate. It was not exactly a low-pressure conversation. Callimachus sided with Miltiades. The decision was made. Athens would fight. The debate was over. The waiting would soon end. Now the citizens of Athens faced a far more intimidating task. Charging across the plain of Marathon directly toward one of the most powerful armies in the world. The debate was over. The decision had been made. At some point during those tense days in September of 490 before Christ, the Athenians looked across the plain at the Persian army and chose the most dangerous option available. They would attack, not defend, not retreat, not wait, attack. The Persian commanders probably did not expect this. After all, they commanded the forces of the largest empire on earth. Their soldiers had conquered vast territories stretching across 3 continents. Most enemies reacted to Persian armies with fear, caution, or outright surrender. The Athenians responded by running directly toward them. Early in the morning, the Greek army formed its battle line. Around 10,000 Athenian hoplites stood shoulder to shoulder, joined by roughly 1,000 loyal soldiers from the small city of Plataea. They faced a larger Persian force spread across the plain. The contrast between the armies was striking. Persian soldiers were often lightly armoured. They relied heavily on archers, mobility, and flexibility. Their equipment allowed them to move quickly across the battlefield. The Greek hoplites were the opposite. Each man carried a large shield, bronze helmet, body armour, and a long spear. Together they formed a dense wall of shields and weapons. Individual skill mattered less than discipline. Every soldier depended upon the man standing beside him. It was essentially a giant moving traffic jam equipped with spears. As the signal was given, the Greek line advanced. Then something extraordinary happened. The Athenians began running. Ancient historians describe the Greeks charging across the plain toward the Persian army. Whether they sprinted the entire distance, or only part of it, remains debated. But the effect was undeniable. The Persians watched thousands of armoured men rushing directly at them. To Persian observers, this may have looked less like military strategy, and more like collective insanity. The charge reduced the time Persian archers had to fire their arrows. Before long, the 2 armies crashed together. The impact was brutal. Bronze shields slammed into wicker shields. Spears shattered. Men pushed, stabbed, struggled, and fought at arm's length. Initially, the Persian centre performed well. The Greek middle ranks began to give ground under intense pressure. For a moment, it appeared the Persian army might break through, but Miltiades had anticipated this possibility. The Greek wings had been strengthened, while the centre was deliberately thinned. As the Persian centre pushed forward, the stronger Greek flanks began driving back their opponents. Slowly the Persian formation became exposed. Then the Greek wings turned inward. The Persians suddenly found themselves trapped. The battle that had begun with a desperate charge was about to become one of the most shocking victories in military history. The battle had reached its decisive moment. What began as a daring Athenian charge was now turning into a disaster for the Persian army. As the Persian centre pushed forward, it seemed for a brief moment that victory might still belong to the invaders. Greek soldiers in the middle of the line were being driven backward. Dust filled the air. Spears snapped. Men shouted orders that vanished beneath the noise of combat. Then Miltiades' plan revealed itself. The strengthened Greek wings had defeated the Persian forces facing them. Instead of pursuing fleeing enemies, they pivoted inward toward the exposed Persian centre. Suddenly, Persian troops who had been advancing confidently found themselves under attack from multiple directions. The hunters had become the hunted. The Greek formations closed in like the jaws of a trap. Persian soldiers fought desperately to escape, but the battlefield had become chaotic. Units became separated. Commands were difficult to hear. The carefully organised invasion force began to lose cohesion, and once an ancient army started losing cohesion, things could unravel very quickly. Fear spreads faster than any messenger. Soon, sections of the Persian line began retreating toward the shore. Then the retreat became a flight. Thousands of Persian soldiers rushed toward their ships anchored off Marathon Bay. What had started as an orderly withdrawal quickly descended into confusion. Men struggled to reach the vessels before the pursuing Greeks caught them. The Athenians pressed forward relentlessly. At the shoreline, some of the fiercest fighting of the entire battle took place. Greek warriors attempted to seize Persian ships before they could escape. Several vessels were captured after brutal hand-to-hand combat. One of the most dramatic moments involved Callimachus, the very man whose vote had helped convince Athens to fight. Ancient accounts claim he died while battling near the ships, struck by multiple enemy weapons as he continued fighting. If true, it was a grim reminder that the men making decisions in ancient warfare often stood in the front lines themselves. By the end of the battle, the Persian army had suffered a shocking defeat. Ancient sources claim Persian losses numbered in the thousands, while Athenian casualties were remarkably low by comparison. The exact figures remain debated by historians, but there is no doubt about the outcome. The Persians had been beaten, not by a rival empire, not by a vast coalition, but largely by the citizen soldiers of a single Greek city. The victory stunned the Greek world. It also created a new problem. The Persian fleet had survived, and while the battle was over, the danger to Athens was not. The Persians still had ships, soldiers, and one final opportunity to strike directly at the city itself. The race to save Athens was about to begin. The Battle of Marathon was won. The Persian army had been driven from the field. Their soldiers were retreating toward their ships. The Athenians had achieved what many thought impossible. But Miltiades was not celebrating. Not yet, because while the Persians had lost the battle, they still possessed something extremely dangerous. Their fleet, the Persian ships, remained intact, and the commanders had one obvious option available. Instead of continuing the fight at Marathon, they could simply sail around the coast and attack Athens directly. The city was vulnerable. Most of its army was still standing on the battlefield miles away. If the Persian fleet reached Athens before the soldiers returned, the city could be caught unprepared. In other words, the battle might have been won while the war was simultaneously being lost. Miltiades understood the danger immediately. There was no time for victory speeches, heroic statues, or lengthy discussions about who deserved credit. The army had to move. Fast. Very fast. The exhausted Athenian soldiers gathered themselves and began one of the most remarkable marches in military history. These men had just fought a major battle. Many were wounded. Most were physically exhausted. All were carrying heavy equipment. Yet they turned around and marched back toward Athens as quickly as possible. The distance was roughly 25 miles. Today that journey sounds challenging. Doing it immediately after fighting for your life in hand-to-hand combat is considerably less appealing. Meanwhile, the Persian fleet was already moving. The ships rounded the southern tip of Attica and headed toward Athens. The Persian commanders may have hoped that the city's defenders had been drawn away to Marathon, leaving the capital exposed. It was a reasonable assumption. After all, armies usually needed time to recover after battle. The Athenians, however, were refusing to behave normally. Hour after hour they marched. Dust rose from the roads. Armour rattled with every step. The men pressed forward despite fatigue, pain, and the relentless heat. At last they reached Athens, and not a moment too soon. When the Persian fleet appeared off the coast, the invaders were greeted by an unexpected sight. The Athenian army was already there. The same army that had defeated them at Marathon now stood ready to defend the city. The Persians had lost their opportunity. After observing the situation, the fleet withdrew. Athens was safe. The victory at Marathon was complete. Yet as the years passed, another story began attaching itself to these events. A story about a lone runner carrying news of victory. A story repeated so often that it eventually became more famous than the march of the entire army. And whether it truly happened or not, it would create one of the most enduring legends in history. The Battle of Marathon was over. Athens had survived. The Persian fleet had withdrawn. For most cities, that would have been enough. History would remember the victory, the soldiers and the generals who made it possible. Instead, history became fascinated by a runner. According to the famous story, a messenger named Phidippides raced from Marathon to Athens after the battle. Upon reaching the city, he announced the Greek victory, delivered his message, and then collapsed dead from exhaustion. It is a dramatic tale. It has everything people love in a legend: a desperate race, a heroic messenger, a final triumphant announcement, and a tragic ending. The problem is that the story becomes less certain the closer historians examine it. The earliest historian to write about the Persian Wars was Herodotus, often called the father of history. Writing only a few decades after the events, he described a remarkable run by Phidippides. But it was not the run most people know. According to Herodotus, Phidippides ran from Athens to Sparta before the battle to request military assistance. This journey covered roughly 150 miles across difficult terrain. Even today, completing such a run would be an extraordinary achievement. Remarkably, Phidippides supposedly reached Sparta in just 2 days. Yet Herodotus says nothing about a run from Marathon to Athens after the battle. Nothing. For a historian who loved dramatic stories, that omission is striking. The more familiar version appears centuries later in the writings of authors such as Plutarch and Lucian. Their accounts describe a victorious messenger racing from Marathon to Athens and delivering news of success before dying from exhaustion. By then, the story had grown considerably. This does not necessarily mean it was invented. Ancient events were often preserved through oral traditions before being written down. It is entirely possible that some messenger carried news from the battlefield to Athens. In fact, someone almost certainly did. The question is whether it happened exactly as later writers described. Historians continue debating the issue today. What is beyond dispute is that the legend captured people's imagination. The image of a lone runner sacrificing everything to deliver a message proved impossible to forget. Meanwhile, the actual achievement of the Athenian army was arguably even more impressive. Thousands of heavily armed soldiers fought a battle and then marched back to Athens at remarkable speed to defend their city. Yet legends have a habit of favouring individuals over crowds. One runner became immortal, and over the centuries, his story would inspire an entirely new tradition, transforming an ancient battlefield into the birthplace of one of the world's most famous sporting events. The Battle of Marathon ended more than 2,500 years ago. The soldiers are gone. The Persian ships have long since rotted away. The battlefield itself has become quiet. Yet somehow the events of that September day continue to influence millions of people around the world. Not because of the battle alone, but because of the legend that followed it. For centuries the story of Pheidippides remained exactly that, a story. Historians debated it, scholars wrote about it, and readers admired it. But nobody turned it into a sporting event. Then, in the late 19th century, something unexpected happened. The modern Olympic Games were being revived. Organisers wanted events that connected the new competition to the glory of ancient Greece. They searched for ways to celebrate the past, while creating something exciting for modern athletes. The legend of Marathon provided the perfect inspiration. A race was proposed that would commemorate the famous run from Marathon to Athens. It was dramatic, it was historical, and unlike chariot racing, it required significantly fewer horses. At the first modern Olympics in Athens in 1896, competitors lined up to run the route associated with the ancient legend. The event immediately captured public attention. Thousands of spectators watched. The race became one of the highlights of the Games. A Greek runner named Spiridon Louis won the event, sending the crowd into celebration. For many Greeks, it felt as though history itself had come full circle. The marathon was born. Over time, the race spread across the world. Cities began organising their own marathons. Athletes pushed themselves to new limits. What started as a tribute to an ancient story gradually became one of the most respected endurance challenges on Earth. Ironically, the modern marathon distance is not even exactly the distance between Marathon and Athens. The current standard was established later for practical reasons involving the Olympic Games in London. History, as usual, refused to remain perfectly tidy, yet the symbolism endured. Every marathon runner participates in something larger than a race. Whether they realise it or not, they are connected to a story born from one of history's most famous battles. A battle where a small city stood against a vast empire. A battle that helped preserve the independence of Athens. A battle that became a legend. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of Marathon. The victory itself changed history. The story that followed changed memory. Together, they created something extraordinarily rare. A moment where history and myth became so tightly intertwined that separating them is almost impossible. And thousands of years later, people are still running because of it. Before Diogenes became the philosopher who lived in a jar, insulted kings, and wandered around Athens behaving in ways that made respectable citizens deeply uncomfortable, he was simply a young man from the Greek city of Sinope on the Black Sea coast. At least that is how the story begins. Sinope was a prosperous trading city. Merchants came and went, ships filled its harbour, and money flowed through its markets. Diogenes grew up in a world where success was measured much like it is today. Wealth, status, influence, and a comfortable place to sleep at night. Ironically, he would eventually reject every one of those things. His father, according to ancient sources, may have worked as a banker or money changer. That detail becomes important because one of the most famous stories about Diogenes involves a scandal surrounding the city's coinage. The exact truth is difficult to determine. Ancient writers rarely let fact stand in the way of a good story. According to tradition, Diogenes or his father became involved in the debasement of currency. In simple terms, someone was accused of tampering with coins. Whether they physically altered them, participated in a financial fraud, or became entangled in a political dispute remains uncertain. What is certain is that trouble followed. Serious trouble. The scandal appears to have resulted in exile. Diogenes was forced to leave Sinope and abandon the life he had always known. One day he was a citizen of a prosperous city. The next he was a refugee. For many people, exile was a disaster. Ancient Greeks placed enormous importance on citizenship and belonging. Being expelled from your city meant losing friends, family connections, legal protections, and social status. Diogenes lost all of it. Yet, what appeared to be a catastrophe would ultimately become the defining turning point of his life. Later writers loved to connect the coin scandal to his philosophy. Some claimed an oracle instructed him to deface the currency. Most people assumed this meant actual coins. Diogenes supposedly came to believe it meant something much larger. Society itself was the currency. Its values were false. Its customs were counterfeit. Its obsession with wealth, reputation, and status was nothing more than a collection of shiny coins everyone pretended were valuable. Whether that interpretation came later or not, it perfectly captures the man Diogenes would become. Exile had stripped away his old life. Soon he would begin stripping away everything else as well. And when he arrived in Athens, he would meet a philosopher whose ideas would transform him from a disgraced exile into one of the most infamous thinkers in history. Exile had taken everything from Diogenes. His city was gone. His reputation was damaged. His future was uncertain. Most people in that situation would have spent years trying to rebuild what they had lost. Diogenes took a very different approach. Instead of rebuilding his old life, he began questioning whether it had been worth building in the first place. That journey eventually brought him to Athens, the intellectual capital of the Greek world. If you wanted to find philosophers in the 4th century before Christ, Athens was the place to be. The city was overflowing with teachers, thinkers, public speakers, and men who enjoyed explaining the meaning of life to anyone unfortunate enough to make eye contact. Plato was there. Aristotle would eventually arrive. Countless lesser philosophers debated politics, ethics, and the nature of reality. Then there was Antisthenes. Antisthenes had once been a student of Socrates and had developed some rather unusual ideas. He believed that virtue was the only true good. Wealth, luxury, status, fame, and comfort were distractions. The best life was one lived according to nature, free from unnecessary desires. Most Athenians thought these ideas were interesting. Diogenes thought they were revolutionary. According to ancient stories, Diogenes became determined to study under Antisthenes. There was only one problem. Antisthenes did not want students. Or at least he did not want this student. Several accounts claim that when Diogenes first approached him, Antisthenes tried to drive him away. One story even says the philosopher threatened him with a stick. Most aspiring students would have interpreted this as a rejection. Diogenes interpreted it as an obstacle, and obstacles existed to be ignored. The story goes that Antisthenes raised his staff and warned him to leave. Diogenes calmly lowered his head and replied that he could strike him if he wished, but he would never find a stick hard enough to drive him away. It was an impressive display of determination, or stubbornness. With Diogenes, the line between the two can be difficult to identify. Eventually, Antisthenes relented. The exile from Sinope became his student. Under his influence, Diogenes began embracing ideas that would define the rest of his life. He rejected the pursuit of wealth. He questioned social conventions. He challenged assumptions that most people accepted without thinking. The more he learned, the more radical he became. Antisthenes taught simplicity. Diogenes decided simplicity should be taken to its absolute extreme. Most philosophers discussed virtue. Diogenes intended to live it, or at least his version of it. Athens was about to discover that giving philosophical ideas to Diogenes was a little like giving a torch to someone standing in a fireworks warehouse. Things were about to become considerably more dramatic. Most philosophers teach ideas. Diogenes preferred demonstrations, and if his audience found those demonstrations shocking, embarrassing, or deeply confusing, so much the better. As his commitment to Cynic philosophy grew, Diogenes began eliminating possessions from his life one by one. Wealth had already lost its appeal. Comfortable housing soon followed. Expensive clothing, social status, and luxury became targets as well. His goal was simple. If happiness depended on things that could be taken away, then happiness was fragile. Diogenes wanted something stronger. He wanted complete freedom. The fewer things he owned, the fewer things could own him. At least that was the theory. Most Athenians considered this philosophy mildly interesting, until Diogenes started putting it into practice. Then they became considerably less enthusiastic. While respectable citizens worried about property, careers, and social standing, Diogenes wandered the city with little more than a cloak, a staff, and a small bag for necessities. He slept wherever he could. He begged when he needed food. He ignored customs that everyone else treated as sacred. The most famous example involved his home. Ancient sources often describe Diogenes as living in a barrel, but that image is slightly misleading. Wooden barrels of the type people imagine today were not common in Greece at the time. What Diogenes actually occupied was likely a large ceramic storage jar known as a pythos. These enormous containers were used for storing grain, oil, wine, and other goods. They were large enough for a person to shelter inside. Most people looked at such a jar and saw storage space. Diogenes looked at it and saw real estate, and unlike Athenian housing, it came with no rent. The sight of a philosopher living inside a giant clay container naturally attracted attention. Some citizens mocked him, others pitied him. Many simply assumed he had lost his mind. Diogenes was delighted. Their reactions proved his point. Athenians spent their lives chasing bigger houses, finer furniture, and greater wealth. Yet here was a man with almost nothing who seemed perfectly content. In fact, he kept finding ways to own even less. One famous story claims he carried a wooden bowl for drinking water until he saw a child cup water with his hands. Realizing the child needed fewer possessions than he did, Diogenes immediately threw the bowl away. The child had apparently outperformed a professional philosopher. Not a great day for philosophy. Yet Diogenes viewed such moments as victories. Every possession abandoned was another step toward freedom. And every convention rejected brought him closer to becoming the most notorious philosopher in Greece. Soon, people would begin comparing him to a dog. To Diogenes, that was not an insult. It was a compliment. The philosopher with no home was already attracting attention across Athens. But Diogenes was only getting started. Living in a giant storage jar was unusual enough. Most people would have considered that the peak of social eccentricity. Diogenes viewed it as the opening act. Soon Athenians began calling him a dog. Today that might start an argument. In ancient Greece, it was usually intended as an insult. Dogs were associated with shamelessness. They slept wherever they pleased, ate whatever they found, ignored social boundaries, and showed little concern for dignity or reputation. Respectable citizens were expected to behave very differently. Diogenes looked at the comparison and thought it sounded excellent. In fact, he embraced it so enthusiastically that it became central to his philosophy. The word cynic comes from the Greek word kynikos, meaning dog-like. Most philosophers spent years building schools and attracting students. Diogenes effectively founded an entire movement based on accepting what everyone else considered an insult. His reasoning was surprisingly straightforward. Dogs lived naturally. They did not obsess over wealth. They did not worry about social status. They did not pretend to be something they were not. They did not spend half their lives trying to impress neighbours. In Diogenes' view, dogs were often more honest than people. That says quite a lot about his opinion of humanity. He began behaving in ways deliberately designed to challenge social conventions. He ate in public when etiquette suggested he should not. He mocked formal manners. He ridiculed wealthy citizens who spent fortunes on luxury while neglecting virtue. The Athenians often reacted with horror. Diogenes considered this evidence that his lessons were working. One of his favourite targets was vanity. Athens was filled with citizens desperate to appear successful, wise, influential, or respectable. Diogenes delighted in exposing the gap between appearance and reality. A wealthy man might boast about his magnificent house. Diogenes would point out that the house seemed to possess more virtue than its owner. A politician might deliver an inspiring speech. Diogenes would ask whether the speaker actually followed any of his own advice. These encounters rarely ended with invitations to dinner. Yet people continued listening, partly because he was entertaining, partly because he was fearless, and partly because beneath all the outrageous behaviour, there was an uncomfortable truth. Diogenes was asking questions many people preferred to avoid. What do you really need to be happy? Why do you care so much about other people's opinions? How much of your life is spent chasing things that do not actually matter? Athens did not always appreciate these questions, but Diogenes asked them anyway, loudly, constantly, and often at the worst possible moment. Soon, he would begin directing those questions toward nearly everyone in the city, from ordinary citizens to the most famous philosophers of his age. By now, Diogenes had become impossible to ignore. Athens was filled with philosophers, politicians, generals, poets, and wealthy merchants. Most of them worked very hard to earn respect. Diogenes worked equally hard to destroy it. Not his own respect, mind you. He had abandoned concern for that long ago. Everyone else's. His favourite pastime was exposing hypocrisy wherever he found it. Unfortunately for the citizens of Athens, hypocrisy was one of the city's most abundant natural resources. Politicians were among his preferred targets. Athens prided itself on democracy, public debate, and civic virtue. Politicians delivered speeches about justice, wisdom, and the common good. Diogenes listened carefully, and then pointed out how little their actions resembled their words. He believed many leaders were simply performers. The stage was larger than a theatre, but the acting was often the same. A man could speak beautifully about virtue while secretly pursuing wealth and power. Diogenes found this both amusing and depressing, mostly amusing. The wealthy fared no better. Athens contained plenty of successful citizens who measured their worth through expensive homes, fine clothing, servants, and lavish banquets. Diogenes viewed these things as evidence of dependence rather than success. One story tells of a rich man proudly showing him a magnificent mansion. After admiring the spotless floors and elegant decorations, Diogenes reportedly spat in the owner's face. When the outraged host demanded an explanation, Diogenes supposedly replied that it was the only dirty place available. Whether the story is true hardly matters. It perfectly captures his style. Subtlety was not his preferred teaching method. Even fellow philosophers became targets. In particular, Diogenes enjoyed mocking Plato. The two men represented almost opposite approaches to philosophy. Plato discussed ideal forms, abstract concepts, and complex theories about reality. Diogenes preferred practical demonstrations. When Plato famously defined a human being as a featherless biped, Diogenes reportedly plucked a chicken, carried it into Plato's school and announced, "Behold, Plato's man." The definition had to be revised. Somewhere in Athens, a chicken accidentally contributed to the history of philosophy. Not every philosopher can claim such an achievement. Despite his constant criticism, people kept gathering around Diogenes. Some came to laugh. Some came to argue. Some came hoping to learn. And many came because beneath the insults and outrageous behaviour, he had a rare quality. He could not be bought. He could not be intimidated. He could not be persuaded to flatter the powerful. Diogenes treated kings, politicians, merchants, and beggars with roughly the same level of respect, which is to say, not very much. Soon he would perform his most famous public stunt of all, a stunt involving a lantern, broad daylight, and a search that would make him legendary for centuries to come. By this point, Diogenes had become one of the most recognizable figures in Athens, not because he held public office, not because he was wealthy, not because he commanded an army, but because he seemed determined to make every respectable citizen uncomfortable. And nowhere was that more obvious than in his most famous stunt. One day, Diogenes was seen walking through Athens carrying a lit lantern. This was unusual for one important reason. It was broad daylight. The sun was shining. Visibility was excellent. Nobody needed a lantern. Curious citizens gathered around him and asked the obvious question, "What are you doing?" Diogenes replied that he was looking for an honest man. The answer instantly transformed a strange scene into a devastating criticism of society. According to Diogenes, Athens was full of people who claimed to be virtuous, honourable, wise, and trustworthy. Yet he could not find a single genuinely honest person among them. Not one. The lantern became a symbol. Every street he walked down, every crowd he entered, every marketplace he crossed carried the same message. You say you are good. You say you are honest. You say you care about virtue. But are you really? Diogenes doubted it. His criticism extended far beyond ordinary citizens. Philosophers, politicians, businessmen, and public officials all found themselves under suspicion. He believed most people were performing roles. The merchant pretended to value fairness while chasing profit. The politician pretended to serve the public while chasing power. The philosopher pretended to seek truth while chasing admiration. Everyone seemed to be acting. Very few seemed genuine. The remarkable thing is that many Athenians secretly agreed with him. They may not have appreciated being insulted personally, but they understood the hypocrisy he was describing. The city was full of ambitious men competing for status, wealth, and influence. Public virtue was often easier to display than to practice. Diogenes refused to participate in the performance. That was what made him both fascinating and infuriating. He lived exactly as he preached. If he condemned luxury, he rejected it himself. If he mocked wealth, he owned almost nothing. If he criticized dependence on power, he remained stubbornly independent. Many Athenians could not decide whether he was a philosopher or a lunatic. Some concluded he was both. Yet his reputation continued to grow. Stories about the strange cynic spread beyond Athens. Travellers carried tales of the philosopher who lived in a jar, insulted the rich, and wandered the streets searching for honesty. Eventually those stories reached the ears of the most powerful man in the Greek world, a young conqueror whose ambitions stretched far beyond Athens. His name was Alexander, and unlike most rulers, Alexander was curious enough to seek Diogenes out personally. The meeting that followed would become one of the most famous encounters in all of ancient history. By the time Alexander arrived, Diogenes was already a legend. Not the kind of legend cities usually celebrate. He had not won great battles. He had not discovered new lands. He had not accumulated wealth or political influence. In fact, he possessed almost nothing. Yet somehow, people across Greece knew his name, and one of those people was Alexander of Macedon. Alexander was still young, but his reputation was growing rapidly. The son of King Philip, educated by Aristotle, and destined to become one of history's greatest conquerors, he represented everything Diogenes supposedly rejected: power, ambition, glory, empire. Naturally, the two men had to meet. According to the famous story, Alexander found Diogenes resting outside Corinth. The philosopher was relaxing in the sunlight, apparently occupied with the demanding task of doing absolutely nothing. A crowd gathered as the future conqueror approached. After all, this was no ordinary visitor. Alexander commanded armies. Kings obeyed him. Entire cities watched his rise with a mixture of admiration and concern. Most people would have been honoured by the attention. Diogenes barely looked up. Alexander introduced himself and offered the philosopher a remarkable privilege. He could ask for anything he wanted. Anything. Wealth, a house, servants, protection, a position at court. The most powerful man in Greece was essentially handing him a blank cheque. Diogenes considered the offer. Then he delivered one of the most famous responses in history. "Stand out of my sunlight." That was it. No requests. No gratitude. No elaborate speech. Just a request for Alexander to stop blocking the sun. The crowd was stunned. Most people spent their lives seeking favour from powerful rulers. Diogenes had just dismissed one as though he were an inconvenient tree branch. What makes the story remarkable is Alexander's reaction. Instead of becoming angry, he reportedly admired the philosopher's independence. As the story goes, Alexander later remarked, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Whether those exact words were spoken is impossible to know. Ancient historians loved memorable quotations. Still, the sentiment feels plausible. Alexander possessed almost everything the world could offer. Diogenes desired almost nothing. Each man represented a completely different answer to the question of how life should be lived. One sought to conquer the world. The other sought to free himself from needing it. In a strange way, both achieved their goals. Alexander would build an empire stretching across continents. Diogenes would become immortal in a different sense, remembered for centuries as the man who feared neither kings nor power. Yet even after humbling Alexander, Diogenes' strangest adventure was still ahead of him. Because at one point, the philosopher who owned almost nothing would lose even his freedom. He was captured by pirates and sold into slavery. Most philosophers spend their lives writing books. Diogenes spent part of his being sold at a slave market. Somehow, this only made his reputation stranger. At some point during his later years, Diogenes was travelling across the Mediterranean when disaster struck. The ship carrying him was intercepted by pirates. Pirates were an unfortunate reality of the ancient world. They raided ships, attacked coastal settlements, and made a profitable business out of kidnapping people for ransom or slavery. Diogenes became one of their captives. For most people, this would have been a nightmare. Freedom was precious in the Greek world. To lose it meant losing control over nearly every aspect of life. A slave could be bought, sold, ordered about, and treated as property. Yet Diogenes approached the situation with his usual level of concern, which is to say almost none. According to later accounts, when the pirates asked what skills he possessed, Diogenes answered, "I know how to govern men." This was a bold statement from a man who technically owned nothing and lived in a giant storage jar. The pirates, however, were intrigued. Eventually, he was taken to a slave market and placed up for sale. Imagine the scene. Potential buyers inspected the captives. Prices were discussed. Merchants negotiated, and among them stood Diogenes, apparently behaving as though he were the only person present who was not a slave. One famous story claims that when the auctioneer asked who wished to buy him, Diogenes pointed toward a wealthy man and declared, "Sell me to that one. He needs a master." Most slaves did not insult potential owners during the sales process. Diogenes was committed to being different. Eventually he was purchased by a wealthy Corinthian named Xeniades. What happened next is particularly revealing. Rather than assigning Diogenes to manual labour, Xeniades reportedly placed him in charge of educating his sons. The former slave became a teacher, and by most accounts, a highly respected one. Diogenes instructed the boys in philosophy, discipline, and self-control. He taught them to value character over luxury and independence over wealth. In other words, he continued doing exactly what he had always done. The legal status had changed. The philosophy had not. That may be the most remarkable part of the story. Most people lose themselves when circumstances change dramatically. Diogenes remained stubbornly consistent. Whether homeless, famous, mocked, admired, free, or enslaved, he continued living according to the same principles. His captors could control his body. They could not control his mind. And as he entered the final years of his life, that stubborn independence would become the foundation of a legacy that neither pirates, kings, nor time itself could erase. By the end of his life, Diogenes had achieved something extraordinary. Without wealth, without political office, without an army, without a home, he had become one of the most famous men in the Greek world. People told stories about him everywhere. Some admired him, some laughed at him, some considered him a genius. Others considered him completely insane. Quite often the same person held both opinions simultaneously. As Diogenes grew older, he continued living much as he always had. He remained in Corinth for much of his later life, teaching, provoking, and challenging anyone willing to listen, or unfortunate enough to be standing nearby. His reputation only grew stronger. Young philosophers sought him out. Travellers carried his stories across the Mediterranean. Even those who disagreed with him could not ignore him. The man who had once arrived in Greece as a disgraced exile had transformed himself into a living legend. Then came his final chapter. Like many aspects of Diogenes' life, the details surrounding his death are wrapped in uncertainty. Ancient sources provide several different accounts. One story claims he died after eating raw octopus. Another suggests he deliberately held his breath until he expired. A third claims he succumbed to illness in old age. Historians generally favour the least dramatic explanation, which, unfortunately, means the octopus probably does not get the final victory many storytellers have granted it. Whatever the exact cause, Diogenes died around 323 before Christ. Remarkably, this was also the year Alexander the Great died. The conqueror who had sought to rule the world and the philosopher who had rejected the world departed history at nearly the same moment. Ancient writers loved pointing out the irony. One man spent his life acquiring everything. The other spent his life proving he needed nothing. Yet both achieved immortality in their own way. After his death, the Cynic movement continued to grow. Later philosophers adopted many of his ideas about simplicity, self-sufficiency, and freedom from material possessions. His influence even helped shape the Stoics, one of the most important philosophical schools of the ancient world. More importantly, his stories survived. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Cities changed. Languages evolved. Yet people kept retelling tales of the philosopher with the lantern, the man in the jar, the slave who acted like a master, and the citizen who told Alexander to move out of his sunlight. That is why Diogenes remains so fascinating today. Not because he had all the answers, but because he spent his entire life asking uncomfortable questions. And unlike most people, he genuinely did not care whether anyone liked the answers.